Okay, so let's just give ourselves a little bit of a deeper insight into this poem, The Prelude by William Wordsworth. So what we're going to do is we're going to apply 5 key ideas so that we can just get 5 great annotations onto the poem. Then we're going to layer in a little bit of that all-important AO3 context. We're going to do all of that within 10 to 15 minutes and just get a really kind of nice kind of core ideas overview of this poem. So let's go for it. Now, the acronym that I use whenever I am doing a kind of first analysis of a poem, whether it's seen or unseen, is FIRST. And what FIRST stands for, it's a neat little acronym. It stands for first and last line, imagery, repetition, structure, and title. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm just going to identify each of those things as it comes up in the text. Then we're going to add our annotations on the top. Okay, so our first and last line, we have one summer evening, led by her, I found, and by day, and were trouble to my dreams. Okay, so there is my F, just going to label it F. Then I'm going to look for a piece of imagery, and the imagery can literally come from anywhere. Sometimes what I like to do is just identify what looks like the longest line in a poem and go, ooh, is that going to be interesting? The horizon's bound, a huge peak, black and huge, as if with voluntary power instinct. Yeah, that's a really good one, and I might just finish the sentence that it comes from. Okay, so there's going to be my imagery. Then repetition. Now, repetition is a tricky one. If you don't have an individual word that's repeated throughout the poem, then you can identify repeated motifs or themes, or you can even look at kind of lexical or semantic fields that kind of create a pattern of repeated ideas. Whatever it might be, in this poem, we're lucky enough that we do have a few words that are repeated. And the one that I'm going to jump into, because I think it's quite significant, is the word silent. Okay, so silent water and silent lake. Okay, so there is my repetition, and I'm just going to label it with an R and connect it to the place it repeats. Okay, then S is for structure. Now, what I'm going to say about structure is that we have essentially a what would we call it? We might call this a kind of cyclical structure. The fact that this is a narrative poem and it starts and ends, or at least returns to, this willow tree. So we have a willow tree at the start, and let's see if we can find it again. Back to the covert of the willow tree. Okay, so I'm just going to put my structure there, and just a kind of a reminder that this is a narrative, and indeed it is somewhat cyclical, and we can talk about the cyclicality of it in a minute. And then finally, although ironically it is the first thing that we see, I'm going to be looking at the title, and the title is the Prelude excerpt. So the kind of key thing to remember there is it is not the whole thing. Okay, so notice that I've started doing my actual annotations now. The reason I start my annotating with the title, even though it's the last thing I label with T, it's because it is the first thing we experience as readers of the poem, and that's obviously the kind of the best way to identify what a poem is doing is to think of it like a first reader to the poem. So what is the effect it has on its audience? And the first effect is created by the title, because it's the first thing you see. So this is an excerpt. It's not the whole thing, okay? There is more to be found. Prelude, relatedly, it is kind of the before now. So that can kind of link to that idea as well. And then this definite article, means that this is unique and most likely personal. Okay, so we're getting an impression of something that is unique and personal, therefore important, and then prelude, it is something that comes before the present day, and this is just one part of the lead up to the present day. Okay, so that's kind of the first impression that we get. Then we jump into our annotations of the first and last line. So one summer evening, led by her, I found a little boat. Okay, so one summer evening, so we get this kind of idyllic pastoral impression to begin with, and then led by her. Okay, who is her? Could it be nature? Remember that this is from a romantic poet. Perhaps, particularly if it is leading him into nature. And then we go straight into something dynamic. Okay, he is doing something. Okay, he is doing something. He chooses I found, dynamic verb, and he is the subject of it. Okay, so although he is led by her, led by nature, he is nevertheless dynamic and in control at this stage. Have a look at the final line of the poem. Moved slowly through the mind and were a trouble to my dreams. Okay, so a trouble to my dreams. You can see that something has changed here. He is no longer in control. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of note there, control lost. It is his dreams that are being invaded by something else. Okay, it is also much less idyllic. The idyllic nature of the beginning, one summer evening, has been lost. It is now trouble to my dreams. Okay, so control has been lost, as has the idyllic situation. Okay, so there is a big change, and that's the first structural point that we can make about this poem, is contrasting the first line to the last line. Okay, let's have a look at the imagery that we picked out. Okay, a huge peak, black and huge. Okay, so we're going to call that kind of tautology. Okay, so where there's unnecessary repetition of ideas. This is someone who is overwhelmed, right? He is not controlling his language in this smooth kind of expressive way you might expect from a poet. It is clear that something has happened to him that is making him emphasize the hugeness of this. And then, as if with voluntary power instinct, we have got obviously some personification or anthropomorphism of this peak. And that is kind of the centerpiece of the poem. This is kind of the focal point, if we're being artistic about it. It is what everything is drawn towards. So our eye is drawn towards the fact that this is probably the longest line of the poem. Okay, so our eye is drawn here. And also to the fact that this is the peak, this is the thing that he's moving towards, and then later on the thing that he is moving away from. Okay, so this moment is clearly quite significant to him. And the personification, and there's this sense of kind of threat, or at least overwhelm. Okay, so a really nice piece of imagery to be identifying there. Then we're going to have a look at our repetition, and the repetition is quite an important or interesting one, because silent, the lake is silent, and this silence is unthreatening. This is unthreatening. Nature as an ally. At this point, the silence of the water means that this is nature on the speaker's side, and we can contrast that with this kind of threat over here that causes the speaker to be kind of overwhelmed and frightened. So we have a silent lake contrasted with this kind of really out there confrontational nature of the huge peak, black and huge. Okay. Then we're just going to comment briefly on the structure, and we'll notice that because of this cyclical structure, starting and ending with the willow tree and the boat, obviously, like we have the boat there as well, we get this kind of chiasmus type cycle where we move in and then we move out. Okay, so it's this kind of X shape where we move in towards something and then we move away from it as well. And what's the point of that? Well, it's because the speaker has been confronted with something terrifying. Okay, confronted with terror. Okay. And then we have done the title. Okay, so what we end up with is a really nicely kind of annotated poem. Okay, so that looks nicely annotated. It's not densely annotated, but it's 5 key ideas which really get to the heart of what this poem is all about. Then we're going to layer on a little bit of context over the top. So something to bear in mind, obviously, if we think about the poet being a romantic poet, obviously Wordsworth was a romantic poet. Focus was on nature, and it's not just celebratory, okay? So nature isn't always just a beautiful thing, but he endorsed this concept of the Burkean sublime, okay? So the sublime was this idea that nature can be beautiful when it's harmonious, like the silent water, but sublime or jarring and disturbing when huge and powerful. So essentially what the sublime as a concept did is it reminded us of our own kind of insignificance in the face of nature in all its glory and grandeur. So there's loads of links that we can make there to the way that this speaker reacts to being confronted with something huge and powerful from nature. Another thing to kind of think about, and it sort of ties in with the title, is that this excerpt comes from an incredibly long poem. This poem is between 7,000 and 8,000 lines, depending on the edition that you read, of which here we have 44, which is less than 1%. Okay, so nice little bit of cross-curricular maths there. If it's less than 1% of the whole poem of this narrated autobiography, we need to remember that this poem is autobiographical and this moment was life-changing. Okay, it's only 1% of the whole thing, but it clearly had such an impact on him that it belonged in this autobiography that kind of detailed him becoming a man and a poet. So this particular moment, this 1% of the entire poem, was clearly a really significant moment for him. It kind of changed the way that he thought about nature. So we can tie these two contextual ideas together. So there we go. We have 5 great annotations, 2 contextual links, and hopefully a better understanding of the poem. And we did it all in 12 minutes.